Welcome back. In this part, we are going to be talking about the cranial nerve portion of the peripheral nervous system. So let's get started. So in order to understand the cranial nerves, we are going to be looking at the undersurface of the brain. And I'm using this drawing just because each nerve-related structure is a different color. So it's very easy for you to follow along this way. And so we're going to have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, some of which are going to be sensory only, some of which are going to be motor only, and some which are going to be mixed. In other words, both sensory and motor. And in a later lecture, we will learn about the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Let me just point out right now that they are all mixed sensory and motor, as hopefully you understood from the introductory peripheral nervous system lecture. And they come out underneath all the vertebrae. And so our lowest spinal nerve is we have one coccygeal nerve, then we have 5 going through the foramina of the sacrum. We have 5 lumbar, we have 12 thoracic. And even though we only have 7 cervical vertebrae, we have 8 cervical nerves. And the reason for that is the first one comes out between the occipital condyle and the atlas. And then there's all the other ones are underneath that. All right, so let's get started with the cranial nerves. So on the right side of the drawing, there are the foramina. So if you're taking lab, then you understand what all these foramina are. And basically, I have just linked the nerves with the foramina, but you'll get that in lab as well. This is just there for completeness sake. So what you need to notice of these 12 cranial nerves, they're all on the undersurface of the brain. And most of the motor fibers, most of the cranial nerves that have motor fibers are going to have their origins in the brainstem, specifically the pons and medulla oblongata, not in the midbrain. Whereas, and then from there, they'll go to the glands and the muscles, the smooth muscles and cardiac muscles. In contrast, most of the cranial nerves that have sensory fibers, those sensory fibers are coming from the head and upper neck area, and then they're going to the brainstem for most of them. Okay, it's not an absolute. Stick with that word most for both of these, because I'll be showing you as we go along where there are examples of things that are different. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want you to realize before we get started, if you look at the words on the left side, what you will have noticed is that cranial nerves in the first place are abbreviated capital C, capital N, and after that, there is a number that's written as a Roman numeral. So when you're learning your cranial nerves, it's important to not only know the name of the nerve, but also to learn the number. Okay. So, except for 2 of the cranial nerves, all of the fibers are going to be on the same side, so there's no crossing over. When it comes to this most significant one that has crossing of the fibers, I'll be showing you that. All right, so let's get started. The first cranial nerve is called the olfactory nerve, and the only thing it does is the sense of smell. Okay. However, let's look at this undersurface of the brain to understand it. So we have the frontal lobe here and the pituitary gland in the middle. So we're going anterior to the pituitary gland. On each side, you have this structure that kind of looks like a Q-tip with a cotton part there. All right. None of that is the olfactory nerve, but they are structures associated with the olfactory nerve. So the stick part of the Q-tip is known as the olfactory tract. Okay. And then the cotton ball part is known as the olfactory bulb. And the olfactory nerve actually travels from the upper nasal cavity, because it's sensory, through little holes the cribriform foramina and that ethmoid bone through the little holes into the olfactory bulb. So the nerve is actually not seen on the undersurface of the skull. Okay. So for this one, olfactory nerve goes to the olfactory bulb, which goes to the olfactory tract, and then the olfactory tract enters the cerebrum. And when we come back and we learn about our special senses, we'll learn the rest of the pathway later on. The second cranial nerve is called the optic nerve. And this one is also only sensory, but this time it's the sense of vision. So this nerve originates at the back of the eyeball. Okay. And it has fibers coming from both sides of the eyeball, and they are in the optic nerve. Then what happens when the optic nerve gets close to the midline of the brain, the fibers which are on the lateral half of the eyeball will stay on the same side of the brain, whereas those that are on the medial half of the eyeball will actually cross over to the other side of the brain. So we have this X-shaped region right here in the middle where we have some fibers crossing and then lateral fibers staying on the same side, and that X-shaped area is called the optic chiasm. And then continuing closer to the brain, where we now have half fibers that were ipsilateral and the other half which are contralateral, that portion is called the optic tract. And it's the optic tract axons who will then be entering into the cerebrum, and we will learn that pathway in great detail when we learn about special senses. All right, now let's talk about the third cranial nerve, which is the ocular motor nerve. And this one is motor only, and what it is motor to is to 4 of the 6 extraocular muscles, or the muscles that moved your eyeball when you are following the bright light at your having a physical. In addition to moving those 4 muscles, it also is responsible for the muscles that surround your pupil, for contracting them so your pupil gets smaller. So when we come back and we learn about special senses, you'll learn the names of all 6 muscles, and the 4 that are innervated by this nerve are the 4 that I have circled in the purple right here. The 4th cranial nerve is called the trochlear nerve, and this one also does motor, but only to one of those extraocular muscles, the superior oblique muscle. And this one is motor, just like the 3rd cranial nerve was motor to the eyeball. And so I said there were 6 muscles that move the eyeball. We did 4 of them with the ocular motor nerve. We've done 1 with the trochlear nerve, so that's 5, which means we have 1 left. And the one that we have left, I'm jumping ahead, is because that is the 6th cranial nerve, the abducens nerve that innervates it. And that muscle is called the lateral rectus muscle. Now, interestingly, all 3 of these nerves will exit from the base of the skull through the same opening to get to that big or eye socket, okay? So they're all exiting, all 3 of these nerves came off the pons, and then they exit through that superior orbital fissure, that big slash in the back of the eye socket, and from there they will branch off to the 6 muscles. And so at the bottom, you have this LR6SO4AO3, which has been on the last 3 slides, okay? And I know you're looking at it, you're trying to figure out what chemistry formula is that, and it doesn't have anything to do with chemistry because there's no element that's an L or an R, okay? And meanwhile, I know the chemistry in you is going, is that sulfuric? What is that? Or aluminum trioxide? I don't know what those are. Okay. So this is just a little mnemonic to help you remember which cranial nerve does which muscles. And so LR6 means the lateral rectus is innervated by the sixth cranial nerve, which is the abducens. SO4 means the superior oblique is innervated by the fourth cranial nerve, which is the trochlea. And ALO3 means all the others, those other four, which is going to be the superior and inferior rectus, the medial rectus, and the inferior oblique. All four of those are innervated by the third cranial nerve, which is the ocular motor nerve. Okay. Now, I want to go and look at this picture on the left for a second, which is the undersurface of the brain. There's the thalamus up here at the top, and I think you can clearly see the cerebral peduncles. And so here's the pregnant belly, which is the pons, and then below that we have the medulla oblongata. So I want to kind of point out to make you understand how you can figure out which nerve is which looking at the undersurface. And that is cranial nerve 1 was way up there. Cranial nerve 2 came in here right where the pituitary gland is. But 3, 4, 5, and 6, where they enter if they're sensory or exit if they're motor from the cerebrum is, or from the brain, is right around the pons. So if you divide this in the mid-sagittal plane and you start anteriorly closest to the midbrain, that's going to be cranial nerve 3. And then coming, a real skinny one coming from the corner where the cerebral peduncle meets the pons, that would be cranial nerve 4. This really big fat one is cranial nerve 5, and we'll talk in a second as to why it's so much bigger. And then, and then as you cruise your way back around the bottom part of the pons, we would have cranial nerve 6. So 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you can count numerically in order, you can figure out which cranial nerve is which by looking at the undersurface of the brain. All right, so let's talk about that big fifth cranial nerve. Cranial nerve 5 is called the trigeminal nerve. And you know that prefix tri means 3. So the reason why the fifth cranial nerve is so big is because it actually has 3 branches. Now this model does not show the 3 branches, but if you look at the picture on the right, you can see the 3 branches of it. The first branch is going to be the most superior, the one in the middle is going to be the second branch, and the third branch actually has both sensory and motor. So the first branch is called the ophthalmic branch, which is OPHTH. Okay. And this branch is only sensory, and where it's sensory to is the upper part of the face and like the male pattern baldness part of the top of the skull. And so this nerve, V1, so the way we call this, trigeminal, when we say cranial nerve 5, we mean trigeminal. And so for ophthalmic, we call it cranial nerve V1, V for the 5, and then a little sub 1 underneath it. Okay. So this nerve is just doing sensation. Similarly, the second branch, V2, is only going to do sensation, and it's going to do sensation in the mid-face area and go up on this side of your eye, so right over your maxilla. And so the second cranial nerve is called the maxillary nerve. The third cranial nerve does both sensory and motor. So that explains why the trigeminal nerve is considered a mixed nerve. And so the sensory component of V3 is down here by your mandible and then coming up posteriorly right in front of your ear. And so V3 is known as the mandibular nerve. And the motor component of the mandibular nerve are muscles of mastication. So some muscles that close your mandible that you learn about in lab. So that's the fifth cranial nerve, and it's 3 branches. So now we're done with the 4 cranial nerves that we can see surrounding the pons. And so as we continue posteriorly, we are going to have cranial nerves that are coming from around the medulla oblongata. So if you look at the picture, we're going to start by the midline, and we will start with 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 going right down like this. And then for 12, we're going to have to go back towards the midline a bit. So I'll show you when we get closer to that. So 7th cranial nerve is the facial nerve. And the facial nerve is a mixed nerve as well. It gives sensation to the sensation of taste to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So that's why the picture of the lollipop is there. It gives motor to all the muscles of facial expression. So any muscles of facial expression that you learn during lab, you also learned that they were innervated by the facial nerve. In addition to that, there is an autonomic nervous system component to the facial nerve, just like there was to the ocular motor nerve. And all the autonomic components are going to be parasympathetic. And the parasympathetic function goes to the lacrimal glands above your eyes, and that causes tear production. In addition, there are 2 salivary glands, which are innervated by the facial nerve. So saliva, tears, taste, and muscles of facial expression. So that brings us to the 8th cranial nerve, which is the vestibular cochlear nerve, which is actually 2 words put together. And so this used to be called the auditory nerve, in which case you could deduce it has something to do with hearing, but it does more than just hearing, and so that's why it was renamed. And so what this is actually 2 nerves that are traveling together, and those are called the vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve. And so both of these are sensory nerve. And so the vestibular part gives us equilibrium, and the cochlear part gives us hearing. And so once again, we're on the medulla oblongata. We started with 7, and now we're going around the corner, ready to start coming south, and that's where the 8th cranial nerve will be. The 9th cranial nerve is called the glossopharyngeal. So stop for a second and see if you can figure out what part of the body this goes to. Okay. So hopefully you all figured out pharyngeal is the pharynx, which is the throat, the back of the throat, and glosso is a term that means tongue. And so the glossopharyngeal nerve is also a mixed nerve. It's going to give us, you see the lollipop picture? It's going to give us taste, only this time we're not the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, we're the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And it's going to give us motor to a pharyngeal muscle whose name we're not going to bother learning, so just has motor to do with swallowing, and it also gives innervation to 1 salivary gland. So we have 3 salivary glands. 2 of them were the previous nerve, and 1 of them is this. In other words, they're not overlapping. They're doing different salivary glands. Now, of all the cranial nerves, the 10th cranial nerve by far is the absolute most important, and it's called the vagus nerve. And vagus is a word that means wandering, because this is the only cranial nerve that goes below the level of your upper chest. And it is going to wander, I just realized you can't see my hand wandering, through your entire thoracic, abdominal, pelvic cavities. And it's a mixed nerve doing both sensory and motor. And so we're still on the medulla oblongata. We did 7, 8 at the corner. We came down 9, and now we're at 10. Okay. So what does it do? See the lollipop? It's going to give us taste once again. It's going to give us mostly parasympathetic. Think of any organ in your chest, abdomen, and pelvis. It's going to give us parasympathetic to almost every organ you can name. Okay, so you don't have to memorize the long list. If you can name the organ at this point, it's got vagus nerve innervation. Okay. I want to point out where it's located in the neck area. Let me go back here. And so if you think about the undersurface of the skull where you have the jugular foramen, I'm not quite sure how I lost the screen, so let me just pull it back up. Where you have the jugular foramen and just anterior, you have the carotid canal, then you know the internal jugular and the internal vein and the internal carotid artery are right next to each other. And right in the groove between the two of them, that's where you find this vagus nerve. And so it travels in the neck just like that. Okay. 2 cranial nerves left. So the next one is the accessory nerve. Oops, there we go. And this one is quite unique. If you look at the picture, you can see the huge foramen magnum, the big hole at the base of the skull. And what you'll notice is this accessory nerve used to be called the spinal accessory because a lot of it comes from the upper C spine. And then it goes into the cranial cavity through the foramen magnum before it then exits again. And what this cranial nerve, the 11th cranial nerve, the accessory nerve does is it innervates exactly 2 muscles. And so the 2 muscles it innervates, I need you to learn, the first one, that big thick muscle here and your neck that you can clearly see, that's the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And it innervates here, so you can see that it's only doing a neck innervation. And then it innervates those superior fibers of the trapezius muscles in their posterior neck. Okay, so I think that's clearly shown on the picture. All right, which brings us to our 12th cranial nerve, and that is the hypoglossal nerve, which means what? That's right, under the tongue. So this is a nerve that travels under your tongue, and it's motor only. It allows you to move your tongue. So let's look at the picture on the left a little closer so you can see where this is. So if we look at the medulla oblongata, what you can clearly see is 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 going out like this. But for 12, we need to go up and then back towards the midline. So this is the 12th cranial nerve right up in here. Okay. So that's the hypoglossal. So remember, under the base of the skull, most anteriorly, you're going to have the olfactory, actually, I think I have a picture. No, I don't have a picture. Okay. You're going to have the olfactory tract with the olfactory bulb. Then you're going to have the optic nerve to the optic chiasm, right where the pituitary gland is, and then the optic tracts. Then we're at the pons, and from the pons, you're going to have 3, 4, and 5. Then we're at the medulla oblongata, starting in the middle. You're going to have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then you're going to come back up and closer to the midline for 12. Okay, so go back to the very first picture where I had the cartoon drawing and cover up the words and see if you can follow that. All right, so what does this mean? Okay, so this is a little mnemonic to help you remember, is the cranial nerve you're thinking about a sensory nerve or a motor nerve? Because sometimes if somebody says, what's the function of cranial nerve 9? You're going, I don't know. But if you can go through and you can realize, oh, I'm looking for something that's sensory, or I'm looking for something that motor, then it may trigger your memory. So here's the mnemonic. SS, some say. MM, marry money. Okay. Get the idea for the graphics now. So some say marry money. B, which means it's both, sensory and motor, but my brother says. So some say marry money, but my brother says. And for 9, 10, 11, 12, big brains matter most. Okay. Now, as far as a mnemonic for looking, for learning the actual cranial nerves, feel free to make one that speaks to you that you can remember. But I'm just going to give you this one for the sensory and motor. Okay. And the last point is there were 4 cranial nerves as I went along: 3, 7, 9, and 10. Ocular, motor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves. Those are the 4 cranial nerves that had parasympathetic functions, okay? So remember, those parasympathetic functions are all going to be parasympathetic motor functions, and it's very important you learn them as well as the general non-autonomic nervous system functions. And with that, we are done with cranial nerves. Thank you for all your hard work, and I will see you again soon.